Alright, well there's much more to explore with the new curve tool, and in particular this menu here, the rotor tools, which ultimately can be used and are really meant to be used for rotoscoping, but not necessarily just for that alone. So let's go step by step here and explore some of these features and see how we can use them. I'm going to start with an image and I'm going to turn this into an animation. So let's go and create an animation. 30 frames is the default, that'll be just fine. And we now have 30 frames along this animation. It goes all the way to the very end here on that end. Okay, so this is frame number 29 because the first of the frame is not number 1, it's number 0. So we go from 0 to 29. That's a total of 30 frames. Alright, so what I'm doing now is I'm going to create a shape that I want to see changing over time. And I'm going to create a curve starting here by inserting a point. And let's say we do something similar to what we had done before, or maybe slightly different. Let's create a cube. Let's go here, something very simple. And the moment we have 4 points, it switches by default to a spline interpolation. If we don't do that, if we don't want that, we can also go to straight line interpolation. You know what? Just for this exercise, let's keep it as a straight line. It is a closed line, and that's a curve here that we can open if we want to. And in this case though, we'll keep it closed. Doesn't really matter for what I'm going to show, because what I'd like to do is basically say, well, let's make a shape that goes from this to a different shape. Maybe a different rectangle, or maybe a different location of this rectangle. So all of the 4 points need to be moved somewhere else, and then maybe somewhere else again. So what you do is you click right over here on Rotor Tools, and you say, let's create a keyframe. Create keyframe, and it reminds us that we are now on a keyframe for this curve. Now what that means is that if we go across it, the curve is still there, but it didn't keyframe all these different shapes, just this one. One more though at the end it did for us also automatically. And that's good if we want it to be actually loopable, if you want the shape animation to be going from a start shape and at the end of it to be the same shape again. So it automatically keyframes the end shape to be the same as the starting shape. From there we can either leave it like that if that's indeed what we want, or we can change it. So we can go to this last keyframe and perhaps say, you know what, let's go and bring it down to almost look like a triangle. Basically we'll move these points to overlap, and if you want to see this really precisely, what you do is you zoom in, right? So you use the magnifying glass and then use the hand to move down, or you use the control and the shift key to move around, and the right button to zoom in. Right, and then you can go and grab this point and really line it up on top as well as possible, and then zoom back out. So this is now the shape we want, and perhaps actually not all of it. Maybe we want to also move this and this point a little bit further up. But essentially we have a triangle now, and we're going to create this as a new keyframe. So now we have stored the shape, the new positions of all these points for this keyframe, and we are now therefore going from this shape to this shape. So we have a shape transformation simply by moving the points of that curve from one shape, from one set of positions to another set. That may not be all we need though. Maybe we want to have something else. Maybe we want to have at this point have it come down here, right, and have this go up there. Let's go keyframe that as well. So we now have a total of 3 keyframes. One at the top here, that's the first one. Then we have one around here, and then one at the very end. Let's do one more. And what I'd like to do is make it look like this thing is moving. And in order to do that, I will simply need to move all these points a little bit around. Now I cannot in this version do this all in unison. I'll have to do this manually. But that's fine. We'll go and do this the following way. I'll grab the points and move them over here to the upper right. Grab this one. And by the way, if you don't want to accidentally add another one, because you know you're still in insert mode. No, actually you're not. You notice that the insert and some other tools have been blacked out, actually blued out. They are not enabled right now because we have keyframes. And once you have a keyframe set, you're kind of stuck with that number of points, and you can still move them, but you can no longer add to them. You can no longer delete an existing point out of the curve, because that would break the topology. Alright, so what we need to do is simply move these points and set another keyframe. So now we have 4 keyframes. Let's do one more, and what I'd like to do is basically have all them come down here to this side. Okay, and keyframe that. So we now have what? 4 keyframes, 5 keyframes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. So what's this good for? Well, for one, it is a shape transformation that you can render into, for instance, you can render a curve along a brush. So you can have it appear as a curve that gets rendered. So that might be the only thing we do here this time on the Rotor tools. There is much more to it though, but right now let's just be happy with that and say, okay, let's go and render a curve along it. We've seen this before. We can go click here and it will render the current brush along that. Now this brush is not very intelligent or sophisticated. Maybe a more sophisticated brush might be one like this hot dog. Let's go back to the curve tool. We're still here and go render the hot dog along that. Well, what if we wanted to do that not only on this one frame but on each of these frames as the curve is changing shape? Well, that's where we can also do this now in 7.1. Let me go and undo this current shape, this current rendering. And what I'll do is, let's see, first of all, store this brush because I think I might want to work with it a little bit more. But definitely one thing I can do now is go to the filter and look for the animated filters. Right? Because what that will do is it shows you an option here called stroke path, where you can stroke the current brush along the path. And I mean, not just on this one frame. That we could do right there, like we did earlier. But what we can do here is have it do that on every frame along the animation. Alright, so let's do exactly that. Let's go stroke path, and it reminds you it's about to do that, stroking the brush, or stroke brush along the animated curve. Yes, sir. And so now it's doing that, and you can see it here in the preview. It's rendering the brush along the changing shapes. It's rendering it along the entire frame sequence. And there we go. So we've now just created this little animation here. Alright, so that's cool, but it's not cool enough for me. So one thing I'm going to do now is to say we need to erase the inside of this. What's here on the inside. How do we erase this? How do we fill it with black, white, or whatever color texture pattern, or something like that? Well, one way to do that is to use another filter very similar to what we just did, which is the animated filter, and there's a fill selection. So this needs to be a selection. It's not yet, but once it is a selection, we can have it go and fill it. Alright, so how do we make sure that right now this curve, this rectangle, becomes the current selection? Well, we remember we can do this right here. We can go to fill the curve, drawing into the alpha plane. So, and in replace mode, and so now that is our selection. Therefore, we could now go and fill that area. But how do we make sure that the next frame where the shape is changing takes on a new shape for the selection? I mean, we don't want to go manually have to do this and replace to this shape. We could, but it's tedious and we'd rather not. So what we can do is we can do this automatically. Right here in the control, in the rotor tools, you can say use the curve as alpha. Use curve as alpha means exactly that. Use the curve as it is and render that into alpha. Make it a selection. Bingo, look at that. It automatically goes into the alpha channel. And we can actually invert it if we don't want the inside selected, instead if we want the outside selected. But for right now, the inside is fine. We can also soften or blur this a little bit. We'll probably stay away from that right now. We'll just use that. We're happy with this. So using the curve as alpha, what does it do? It says, well, look, there's a curve. Let's go render it into alpha. Now let's go to the next frame. Oh, look, there's a different curve. Because it changed shape, right? We interpolate along the keyframes and it renders to a new alpha. It renders a new alpha into the alpha channel. So a new selection, every time you go or you scrub through that, it immediately renders that curve into the alpha channel to define a selection. And then you can do your magic, right? So here you can go and say, let's go fill it with something, with a background, with a raster, with a gradient of some sort or whatnot. I'm going to just say let's fill it red. In fact, I'm going to grab one of the reds right here. So I'm going to go with the turkey baster here, the color selection tool, and select kind of this orange color right there. So that's our primary color as you see here. And the next thing I'm going to do is simply, as I'm seeing this and I want it to go across each frames, fill it with the fill tool. Perhaps one more thing I want with the fill tool is a little bit of a paper texture. So I'm going to choose the stucco mode, and there we go. Bumpiness, and that should be fine. So now let's go and see what happens if I fill it just manually to do a quick test first. Yep, there it is. Now it's actually filling it with a gradient. It's not what I had hoped for, but maybe that's because my fill settings are currently still set to use the gradient. So let's go check the fill settings. Yep, sure enough, we have the gradient vertically. So we don't want that, we want the plain color instead. Alright, so when we are in plain color mode, undo this most recent one, let's go and fill it. There we go, that's what I was looking for. Alright, so I want this, and I want it to be rendered again and again every frame as the shape is changing. And that's how we do that. We go to the filter. It's an animated endeavor, so we go to the animated filter submenu, and there it is, fill selection. And it will do this on every frame. And it does that pretty quickly, if you ask me. Look at that. So we have now a nice little animation. The curve, we don't need it anymore. Now, before you go toss it, you know how you change your mind all the time and you say, oh shoot, I wish I had kept this curve because I want to do something else with it. Well, you know, if you ever do something like this and you spend 10 minutes on a curve, you might want to save it. So there's another option here too, and that is to save it. Go and save it. Even if you don't know if you'll ever use it again, right? Call it that. Will I ever need you? And we have there a RTO file, a roto file, because it's useful for roto curving, but it's also useful simply to save as a temporary curve, a work in progress, because mom says it's time to take the trash out of the house, and you got some other stuff to do, and you want to get back to it a little bit later and be able to load that curve back in. Alright, so if I'm now deleting this curve and also clearing the selection, bingo, I'm done. I've lost the information, but not all is lost because I can get back to it. I can open it, I can say, yes, I will need you again, and there it is again. So now the curve is back here, and if I were to, let's say, erase, we can see indeed it still has the keyframe, and it has a keyframe at the very end as well. So let's go not erase this, and there we go. So we now have essentially seen one more way to use the curve tool with the keyframes, and I think I may want to jump back to the alpha channel here. There it is. Alright. Alright, so we do have, let's see, let's go delete this curve, and there we go. Delete the selection. Alright. So that sums it up for this quick module on using that. Now, one thing that you may have seen in a prior example, I was turning this into a looping or a bouncing animation. And that's another thing we can also do here. Kind of unrelated to the curve tool, but certainly something that you might want to do also next in many cases. Which is, I want it to, when it ends here at this shape, the triangle, I want it to go back all the way to the rectangle. Alright, so how do I do this? Let's say I don't need this frame, I'm going to delete this one. I have this frame and this one, and I want to go all the way here and then have it go back. But I can't play it backwards. I have to play it forward from left to right, from first frame to last frame. How do I do this? Well, what I can do is I can grab the first frame, and that would be this one, and make this the in point of our marker. I'm going to mark a zone or a block, select a block of frames. And then I'm going to the last frame, which is this one here, and make this the out marker. So now you see there's a blue selection on all the frames that were selected. And I will now copy that into a temporary placeholder, copy the block. Right? So when I copy the block, I have a copy of all these frames. And I can now do something else to these frames, such as, for instance, reversing them, reversing the order. Instead of going from left to right, I go from right to left. So I can go to frames in the animation menu and reverse frames. And so now you can see that this one is indeed going from the triangle to the rectangle, whereas the original went from the rectangle to the triangle. But I still have a copy of that original. And if I go to the first frame, I can right-click here and say there it is, insert block before the current frame. Right. So now I'm inserting the original right in front of that. And what that means is that I'm back to having that original there, the rectangle, turning into the triangle in the middle of the animation, and then turning back into the rectangle because I had inverted that sequence. So now we have a first animation that's doing a ping pong mode, playing, even though I'm playing from left to right continuously. It looks like it's doing a ping pong.